So it appears that Donald Trump has reached the point that every war leader dreads. He needs to accept that America has lost the Iran war and negotiate the least damaging exit still available. Now, this defeat is strategic rather than on the battlefield. Make no mistake, Iran has been battered, but without being compelled. Hormuz remains largely closed, and the nuclear danger has not been demonstrably removed. So what does a deal mean? Well, it means securing the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz above all else. This would arrest the economic shock that is inevitable to hit the world, and then extracting whatever verifiable nuclear constraints can be won. I mean, calling this a victory would be an insult to everyone's intelligence. But to continue the war, to escape the humiliation, would deepen the damage. Now, Trump says he cancelled the planned strike after Iran and several regional governments urged him to hold fire while the outline of an agreement emerged. The public picture is actually a bit more murky than that. Tehran denies asking Trump to stop the attack, denies agreeing to reopen Hormuz, and has placed its forces on heightened alert. So the mediators are describing a proposal that's still under discussion. There's no signed settlement, no visible Iranian concession, and yet America has paused its attack while Iran retains the levers that forced Washington back towards negotiation. And what this shows us is that states can still dominate the exchanges of fire, just as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and still lose the war. American forces with the Israelis have damaged military infrastructure, they've killed senior figures, destroyed weapons across Iran. But Tehran has kept its hand on Hormuz, threatened America's Gulf partners, and imposed punishing costs on Western military inventories. And the United States has failed to compel Iran to abandon those methods. It's also failed to produce a credible route towards dismantling Iran's nuclear program. So Iran might leave the conflict poorer and militarily depleted, whilst also at the same time gaining proof that it can bend Washington's choices. Now, the Trump administration went to war before it had answered the elementary strategic questions. What happens if Iran makes Hormuz commercially unusable? How long can American and Gulf air defences sustain a missile and drone campaign? And what political settlement follows the final strike? Those answers should have existed before the first missile left an aircraft. A target list, however impressive, cannot supply strategic answers. Spectacular destruction was allowed to masquerade as strategy. And that constraint is now brutally material. America and the Gulf states possess enormously capable weapons, although the stockpiles behind them were built for shorter campaigns. A prolonged exchange consumes interceptors and long-range precision weapons far faster than peacetime production lines can replace them. The estimates that we're seeing in the public domain recently suggest that several critical American missile stocks have been depleted heavily enough to take years to rebuild. And you can read a longer article about this on my Substack, and I'll drop the link down at the bottom. The United States still has weapons available for further action against Iran, but sustaining the campaign while providing credible reserves to their partners who've bought American weapons, reserves to the Korean Peninsula and the Western Pacific, is a far harder proposition. America's Gulf partners face the same arithmetic while trying to defend their bases, cities, ports, refineries, pipelines, and desalination plants. Neither Washington nor its regional allies appears to have the magazine depth required to suppress Iran's dispersed launch network, protect every vulnerable site, and maintain that effort indefinitely. A few impressive defensive nights cannot carry a war strategy. Now, Iran understands this exchange rate. It can send comparatively cheap drones and missiles towards expensive infrastructure, forcing its opponents to answer with scarce interceptors, each costing many times more. Now, each interception saves lives, but it also empties the magazine a little further. Each weapon that gets through raises the political pressure on governments already frightened by a wider economic collapse. So Iran's decisive levers are its missile arsenal and the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran has no need to defeat the United States Navy in a conventional fleet action, and it could never dream of doing so. But it can keep Gulf infrastructure at risk while making passage through the strait dangerous enough that insurers, ship owners, and energy companies withdraw. Before the war, roughly a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passed through that narrow waterway. Iran therefore has its hand on the valve feeding fuel prices, inflation, and industrial production across the world. It doesn't have to sink every tanker, because it's uncertainty that makes the shipping lane go empty long before mines and missiles close it physically. That pressure could potentially spread westwards as well through Iran's network of armed partners. Houthi threats against the Bab el-Mandeb place another maritime artery under strain, while pipelines and terminals intended to reduce dependence on Hormuz remain vulnerable to drones and missiles. So geography has given Tehran several ways to keep the energy shock alive. American technological superiority looks less decisive inside a prolonged contest of endurance. A stealth bomber can demolish another facility and a cruise missile can find another command post, but neither action compels a regime to abandon a strategy that appears to be working. Time strengthens Iran's position. Trump faces the midterm elections, congressional pressure, public anger over prices, and of course a presidency that ends in January 2029. The Iranian regime then can crush their domestic opposition, force hardship upon its own population, and simply wait for American politics to intervene. Every additional week damages the White House faster than it threatens the survival of the men making decisions in Tehran. Iran has designed its campaign around that imbalance, using temporary agreements as pauses while retaining the ability to resume pressure. Unfortunately, America's remaining choices are dreadful. Further limited strikes might destroy more facilities, but they're not going to shift the strategic balance. Attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure not only stray into the war crime space, but also invite retaliation against Gulf production and could tip a strained world economy into recession. A ground campaign would be a military and political nightmare. Maintaining the blockade consumes more resources while prolonging the energy crisis, and withdrawal without terms would advertise the success of Iranian coercion and leave the regime confident that it can repeat the exercise. A deal has therefore become the least bad of a number of bad options. Trump should take it, state honestly what it represents, and stop pretending that another round of bombing can recover the political outcome his campaign failed to deliver. Any agreement worth signing must restore freedom of navigation through Hormuz and halt attacks on Gulf states. I think it's questionable whether any deal is now going to be able to recover intrusive access to Iran's nuclear sites. Whilst we'd all appreciate it freezing the most dangerous nuclear activity or accounting for the enriched uranium stockpile, or even establish penalties that can be imposed quickly when Tehran cheats, the way things have evolved, that's unlikely. So even those terms are unlikely and may buy time rather than remove the threat. And the nuclear fallout from this is going to last for a generation. Iran now has an overwhelming incentive to obtain a nuclear weapon, which the regime will view as insurance against another American attack and a shield behind which it can continue coercing its neighbours. And the likely weak settlement that we're going to see would certainly accelerate that calculation. Regional governments are going to draw the opposite lesson from the same events. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and the UAE are now going to have to ask how much confidence they can realistically place in American protection once the costs become politically painful in Washington. Nuclear hedging is going to identify, and the risk of a regional nuclear arms race has moved sharply closer. Once that process begins, it's not going to be contained neatly. Rival enrichment programs, ambiguous weapons capabilities, and shortened warning times would leave every future crisis in the Middle East more dangerous. Decisions made during this war may still be shaping Middle Eastern security when today's leaders are long gone. We've watched the credibility of American deterrence in the Gulf collapse in public. Deterrence rests on an adversary believing that aggression will fail and that the price will exceed any possible gain. Iran absorbed devastating blows, retained its central sources of leverage, and pushed the United States towards talks conducted under the shadow of an energy crisis. The volume of explosives dropped cannot conceal that outcome. American hard power remains immense, yet its promise of automatic strategic dominance has now been shattered. Tactical reach achieved remarkably little once Washington failed to convert destruction into an enforceable political result. Beijing will now study how maritime pressure, economic pain, and political patience narrowed America's options. Those lessons will feed directly into Chinese thinking about Taiwan. Moscow will see an America distracted, depleted, and increasingly anxious to end another long war, while Ukraine still depends on Western attention and ammunition. The ongoing artificial intelligence contest also depends on reliable energy, vast capital flows, and stable supply chains. A chronic Gulf crisis raises the cost of all three and unsettles regional partners investing heavily in American technology. Hostile powers positioned near other maritime bottlenecks will notice that a narrow waterway can yield leverage against a much larger military. Trump now has to cut the deal and admit why it became necessary. America entered a war without the ammunition depth, defensive capacity, or political plan required to impose its desired outcome. Iran found the point at which American power could be made to bend and pressed until Washington blinked. Political courage now requires accepting the defeat that military theatre cannot conceal. Trump can still stop the killing and limit the economic damage, but he cannot recover the deterrence squandered by beginning a war he had no means to finish. The strike may have been cancelled, but the bill for this disaster is only beginning to arrive.